I never believed that a single act of kindness, performed in silence and without expectation, could unravel the entire fabric of my existence and weave it anew. Yet here I am, years later, still marveling at how a torn coat and a needle threaded with ordinary silk became the instruments of my deliverance. My name is Honoria Ashworth, and I was 24 years old when my life changed forever on a night so fierce with rain that I thought the heavens themselves were weeping. I lived alone in a small cottage at the edge of Wiltshire, a dwelling that had belonged to my parents before consumption claimed them both within the same cruel winter. The house was modest but well kept, with climbing roses that bloomed in summer and a kitchen garden that provided just enough to see me through the colder months. I earned my living as a seamstress, a trade my mother had taught me from the time I could hold a needle, and though I was not wealthy, I had my dignity and my independence, two possessions I guarded with quiet ferocity. The cottage itself was a testament to my parents' modest dreams. My father, Thomas Ashworth, had been a clerk in the offices of a local solicitor, a man of careful habits and quiet pride who had saved every spare penny to purchase this small piece of England for his family. My mother, Mary, had transformed those 4 rooms into a home, filling them with the scent of baking bread and the soft melodies she hummed while she worked. Together, they had given me something more valuable than wealth or position. They had given me the certainty that I was loved. When they died within 3 weeks of each other, I was 21 and utterly alone. The consumption had swept through our village that winter like a reaper, claiming the young and old alike, and my parents had been among its victims. I remember standing at their graves in the churchyard, the ground frozen beneath my feet, the wind cutting through my thin mourning dress, and feeling as if I had been cast adrift on a vast and indifferent sea. There was no one to turn to, no family to take me in, no inheritance to sustain me. There was only the cottage, the small sum my father had managed to save, and the skills my mother had placed in my hands. I survived. That first year was the hardest, learning to manage alone, to stretch my resources, to seek work without appearing desperate. The village of Hartwell knew me as the seamstress's daughter, and gradually, they came to know me as a seamstress in my own right. I mended and altered and created, my needle flying through fabric with the precision my mother had drilled into me since childhood. My stitches were invisible, my repairs seamless, and my discretion absolute. If Lady Pemberton needed her gown let out before the autumn ball, no one would ever know from my lips. If the vicar's wife required a patch on her husband's Sunday coat, the secret remained between us. I built a small reputation on reliability and silence. In a world that often punished women for speaking too much, I had learned that quiet could be its own form of power. The gentry trusted me with their secrets, their vanities, their small embarrassments, and I kept them all locked away behind my lips. It was a lonely existence, but it was mine, and I had come to accept it. But loneliness was my constant companion, as present as my shadow, as familiar as the ache in my fingers after a long day's work. In the evenings, when the light grew too dim for fine needlework, I would sit by my window and watch the road that wound past my cottage toward the great estates in the north. Carriages would pass sometimes, their lanterns swaying like earthbound stars, carrying people to destinations I could only imagine. I wondered about the lives unfolding behind those curtained windows, the conversations, the laughter, the secrets whispered between lovers. My own heart had never known such intimacy. There had been a young man once, the blacksmith's apprentice, a broad-shouldered fellow named Samuel with kind eyes and calloused hands. He had looked at me with something like admiration when I brought him buckles to repair, and for a brief, foolish season, I had allowed myself to wonder if perhaps my story might include love after all. But Samuel had married a farmer's daughter, a girl named Eliza with a substantial dowry and hips that promised many children, and I had wished him well without bitterness. I understood. Love was a luxury I could not afford, and he deserved a wife who could offer him more than I ever could. After Samuel's wedding, I stopped watching for his face in the village. I stopped imagining conversations we might have, walks we might take, a future that might unfold between us. I folded those dreams away like winter linens and stored them in the attic of my heart, where they gathered dust and were eventually forgotten. Or so I told myself. The night the stranger came, October had already stripped the trees of their leaves and scattered them across my garden like abandoned letters. The autumn had been mild until then, but that morning had brought a change, a sharpness in the air that promised early frost and bitter winds. I had spent the day finishing a commission for Mrs. Whitfield, the magistrate's wife, who required a new collar for her dinner gown. The work had been intricate, requiring the attachment of delicate lace to silk without leaving visible stitches, and my eyes ached from the strain. I was preparing for bed, had already changed into my nightgown and wrapper, when the first crack of thunder shook the window panes. I went to the window and watched as lightning split the sky, illuminating the garden in flashes of white brilliance. Within moments, rain began to fall with such violence that I could hear nothing else, not the creaking of the house, not the wind in the chimney, not my own heartbeat. I was banking the fire, ensuring the coals would keep through the night, when the knock came. It was not a timid knock, the hesitant tap of a servant or a nervous neighbor. Nor was it an urgent pounding, the frantic hammering of someone in distress. It was something in between, firm yet controlled, as if the person on the other side was accustomed to being answered but too weary to demand it. I hesitated, my hand on the poker, my heart suddenly racing. A woman alone did not open her door to strangers after dark, especially not on a night when the world seemed determined to tear itself apart. The village was half a mile away, and while my neighbors were good people, they were also occupied with their own concerns on such a night. If I screamed, no one would hear me. If something happened, no one would know until morning. But something in that knock, some quality I could not name, compelled me to take the candle from the mantel and approach the door. Perhaps it was the rhythm of it, patient rather than threatening. Perhaps it was simply that I had spent too many years alone, and even danger seemed preferable to another evening of solitude. Whatever the reason, I found myself reaching for the latch. I opened the door only a few inches, just enough to see without being seen. The candle's flame guttered in the wind that swept through the gap, and for a moment I could see nothing but rain and darkness. Then lightning flashed again, and I saw him. The man standing on my threshold was tall, perhaps 6 feet or more, with shoulders broad beneath a riding coat that hung heavy with rain. His hat was pulled low over his brow, shadowing his features, but I could see the line of his jaw, clean-shaven and strong, and the glint of eyes that caught the candlelight like dark water. Behind him, barely visible through the downpour, a horse stamped and snorted, its breath steaming in the cold air, its dark coat glistening with rain. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, and his voice was deep, cultured, the kind of voice that belonged in drawing rooms and parliamentary chambers, not on the doorstep of a seamstress's cottage. "My horse threw a shoe 3 miles back, and I cannot continue in this weather. I ask only for shelter until the storm passes. I will pay whatever you require." I studied him as best I could in the flickering light. His clothes, though drenched, were clearly expensive. His boots, though muddy, were well made. Everything about him spoke of wealth and breeding, and yet here he was, alone on a country road in the middle of a tempest, asking a stranger for help. I should have refused. Every instinct of caution, every warning my mother had ever given me, told me to direct him to the village inn, half a mile down the road. But the rain had become a curtain of silver behind him, and his horse was trembling with cold and exhaustion, and there was something in his posture, a weariness that went deeper than physical fatigue, that made me step aside and gesture him into my home. He entered with a nod of gratitude, removing his hat to reveal dark hair plastered to his forehead and features that were striking in their austerity. He was not handsome in the soft, pleasant way of the men in my village, the round-cheeked farmers and pink-faced shopkeepers who smiled easily and laughed often. His face was all angles and shadows, a face carved by some sculptor who preferred drama to prettiness. His cheekbones were sharp, his brow heavy, his mouth a firm line that looked as if it had forgotten how to curve into a smile. And his eyes, I now saw, were gray, the color of the storm clouds that still rumbled overhead, and they assessed my humble dwelling with an expression I could not read. I took his coat without speaking. The wool was heavy with water, and I had to use both hands to lift it from his shoulders. That was when I noticed the tear. The right shoulder seam had split, probably caught on a branch during his ride, and the fabric gaped open to reveal the lining beneath. It was a fine coat, the finest I had ever touched, made of wool so soft it felt like velvet against my fingers. The stitching was expert, the buttonholes precise, the kind of garment that cost more than I earned in a year. The damage was not severe, but it was visible, and something in me, some instinct as old as my craft, could not bear to see good work ruined. I hung the coat by the fire to dry and busied myself making tea. The stranger stood uncertainly in the center of my small parlor, too large for the space, like a hawk that had accidentally flown into a dovecote. His presence seemed to fill every corner, making the room feel smaller than it was. I gestured to the chair nearest the hearth, and he sat, his long legs stretched toward the flames, his wet boots steaming gently in the warmth. "You are kind," he said, watching me move about the kitchen. Not everyone would open their door on such a night. I poured hot water over the tea leaves and let them steep. "Most people have nowhere else to go on such a night," I replied. He made a sound that might have been a laugh, though there was no humor in it. True enough. I handed him the tea without further comment. His hands wrapped around the cup gratefully, and I noticed that they were broad and capable, the hands of a man who rode his own horses rather than relying on grooms. There were calluses on his palms, unusual for a gentleman. While he drank, I retrieved my sewing basket from its place by the window. The basket had been my mother's, a sturdy thing of woven willow with a fabric lining she had embroidered with forget-me-nots. Inside, arranged with the precision she had taught me, were needles of various sizes, spools of thread in every color, a small pair of scissors with mother-of-pearl handles, and all the other tools of my trade. The coat was still damp, but the wool was resilient, and I knew from experience that if I waited until morning, the fabric would stiffen and become harder to work. I examined the tear more closely now, holding it up to the firelight. The seam had given way along approximately 4 inches, but the fabric itself was undamaged. A simple repair, really, but one that would be visible if not done properly. I selected silk thread that matched the coat's dark blue precisely, a shade I happened to have because Mrs. Whitfield's husband owned a coat of similar color. I threaded my needle by the light of the fire, angled the fabric across my lap, and began to work. He watched me. I could feel his gaze as I sewed, though I kept my eyes on my stitches. There was something unnerving about his attention, an intensity that made the small hairs on my arms stand at attention. But I did not falter. My mother had taught me to sew through any distraction, through hunger and cold and grief, through the jeers of other children who mocked my patched dresses, through the loneliness that had settled over me like a second skin. I could certainly sew through the scrutiny of one tired traveler. The work took perhaps 20 minutes. I used small, precise stitches that disappeared into the weave of the fabric, pulling the thread with just enough tension to close the gap without puckering the material. When the seam was closed, I reinforced it with a row of invisible stitches along the inside, ensuring it would be stronger than before. When I finished, I examined my work by the firelight, turning the fabric this way and that, and found it satisfactory. The repair was undetectable. I returned the coat to its place by the hearth to continue drying, and resumed my seat across from the stranger. He set down his teacup and leaned forward slightly, his gray eyes studying me with that same unsettling intensity. "You did not ask my name," he said. "You did not offer it," I replied. Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or amusement, Most people ask. Most people want to know who they have allowed into their home. I folded my hands in my lap, keeping my posture straight, refusing to be intimidated. A name tells me nothing about a man's character. His actions tell me everything. He studied me for a long moment. The fire crackled between us, and outside, the storm continued its assault on the world. But inside this small room, a strange sort of stillness had settled. Then he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, and the tension that had been coiled in his frame seemed to release all at once. "You are a philosopher," he murmured, "or a saint." "Neither," I said. "Only a seamstress." His lips twitched, almost a smile. "Only," he repeated softly, as if the word amused him. He slept in that chair by my fire. I did not invite him to, did not offer a blanket or a pillow, but at some point in the night, exhaustion overcame him, and his head fell back against the chair, and his breathing deepened into the rhythm of sleep. I watched him for a moment, this stranger who had appeared out of the storm, and something in my chest tightened with an emotion I could not name. I retreated to my bedroom and wedged a chair beneath the door handle, not from fear, but from simple prudence. Then I lay in my narrow bed and listened to the storm exhaust itself against the hills, wondering what morning would bring. When I rose at dawn, he was already gone. The coat had vanished with him, and the fire had burned down to embers. But on the chair where he had slept, he had left a small purse, and when I opened it with trembling fingers, I found 5 gold sovereigns gleaming in the pale morning light, more money than I had ever seen at once in my life. There was no note, no explanation, no message of any kind. Only the coins, heavy and cold in my palm, like a dream that had left behind physical evidence. I stood in my parlor and stared at the sovereigns for a long time. Then I tucked the purse into my work basket and returned to my routine. There was mending to finish, deliveries to make, vegetables to harvest from the garden before the first frost. Life did not pause for mysterious strangers or unexpected windfalls. I thought of him occasionally throughout the day, wondered where he had gone and whether his horse had been reshod, but I did not dwell on it. Strangers passed through Wiltshire every day. I could not afford to collect them in my memory like pressed flowers. I had learned long ago that attachment to things I could not keep only led to heartache. But the following afternoon, as I was hanging linens in my garden, the white sheets billowing in the autumn breeze like flags of surrender, I heard a sound that made me pause. It was the thunder of hooves, many hooves, approaching from the north. I straightened and shaded my eyes against the afternoon sun, and what I saw made my heart stop beating for one impossible moment. Soldiers. No, not soldiers. Guards. 50 of them at least, riding in formation down the narrow road that led to my cottage. They wore crimson coats with gold braid, and their horses were magnificent creatures, matched bays with manes that rippled like dark silk. At the head of the column rode an officer whose uniform was even more elaborate, his hat plumed with white feathers, his bearing rigid with authority. They stopped at my gate. The horses stamped and snorted, breath steaming in the cool air, and the guards sat at attention, their faces impassive beneath their tall hats. The officer dismounted and approached me with steps that were formal, measured, as if he were crossing a ballroom rather than my overgrown garden path. I stood among my flapping linens with dirt beneath my fingernails and my hair escaping its pins, and I felt suddenly, absurdly, like I had wandered into someone else's dream. This could not be real. This could not be happening. 50 royal guards did not appear at the gates of seamstresses. "Miss Honoria Ashworth?" the officer inquired, his voice clipped and precise. "I am she." My voice sounded strange to my own ears, too calm, too composed, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. He removed a sealed letter from his coat and presented it to me with a slight bow. "His Grace the Duke of Thornbury requests the honor of your presence at Ashford Hall. A carriage has been provided for your comfort. You may bring whatever possessions you require. I stared at the letter in my hand. The paper was thick, cream-colored, obviously expensive. The seal was crimson wax, stamped with a crest I did not recognize, a falcon with spread wings above a shield bearing 3 stars, the Duke of Thornbury. I had heard the name before, whispered in the village, spoken with a mixture of awe and scandal by the women who gathered at the well. He was said to be cousin to the king, one of the wealthiest men in England, a figure of mystery who had retreated from society years ago after some disgrace that no one would speak of plainly. Some said he had killed a man in a duel. Others claimed he had been involved in some treasonous plot. The truth, as always, was probably less dramatic than the rumors, but the mystery had only added to his legend. There must be some mistake, I said. I do not know the Duke of Thornbury. The officer's expression did not change. His face might have been carved from the same stone as the statues in the great houses I had glimpsed through gates. His Grace anticipated your confusion. He asked me to convey that he has not forgotten the kindness you showed him during the storm, nor the quality of your work. He wishes to make you an offer of employment. And then I understood. The stranger in my parlor, the man whose coat I had mended while he watched in silence, the man who had left gold sovereigns on my chair as if money meant nothing to him, that man was a duke. That man was one of the most powerful figures in the kingdom. And he had sent 50 of the king's guard to my door because I had sewn a torn seam without asking anything in return. The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. I put out a hand to steady myself against the fence post, trying to make sense of this impossibility. A duke. I had given tea to a duke. I had mended his coat while he slept in my parlor chair. I had spoken to him as if he were an ordinary man, had refused to ask his name, had treated him with what? Not disrespect, certainly, but not the deference that was surely his due. I should have refused. A sensible woman would have thanked the officer for the invitation and explained that she was quite content with her current circumstances. I had my cottage, my work, my independence. What could a duke offer me that would be worth surrendering all of that? But sense had never been my strongest virtue, and something deeper than sense was stirring in my chest. Something that felt like the first green shoots of spring pushing through frozen earth. I had spent 4 years alone in this cottage, sewing other people's garments and watching other people's carriages pass by in the night. I had accepted that my life would be small, quiet, unremarkable, and now a door was opening before me, a door to a world I had never dared to imagine, and some reckless part of my soul wanted desperately to walk through it. I will need an hour to pack, I said. The officer nodded, his expression unchanging. We will wait. I entered my cottage and moved through the rooms as if in a trance. My hands seemed to belong to someone else as they opened drawers and selected garments. I packed my best dress, the dark green wool that brought out the color of my eyes. I packed my mother's pearl earrings, small and modest, but infinitely precious. I packed my sewing basket with its familiar tools, my constant companions for as long as I could remember. I watered the plants in the window boxes and banked the fire and locked the door behind me, tucking the key into my pocket. I did not know if I would ever see this cottage again, did not know what awaited me at the end of this journey, but I knew that if I did not go, I would spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. Then I climbed into the carriage that waited at my gate, a vehicle more luxurious than anything I had ever seen, with velvet cushions and curtains of embroidered silk, and I allowed myself to be carried away from everything I had ever known. The journey to Ashford Hall took 3 hours, the carriage was well sprung, the road surprisingly smooth, and I spent most of the time pressed against the window, watching the landscape transform. The modest farms of Wiltshire gave way to something grander, wilder, more romantic. The hills grew steeper, crowned with ancient oaks that had stood for centuries, their branches bare now, but their trunks thick with the wisdom of ages. Rivers glittered in the valleys below, crossed by stone bridges that looked as old as England itself. and the estates we passed grew larger and more impressive with each mile, their gates increasingly ornate, their grounds increasingly vast. And then, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, I saw it. Ashford Hall rose from the landscape like something from a fever dream, a vast mansion of honey-colored stone with hundreds of windows that caught the dying light and blazed with golden fire. The house was built in the classical style with a central block flanked by symmetrical wings, but its scale was almost beyond comprehension. I counted rows of windows, lost track, started again. There must have been 200 at least, perhaps more. Towers anchored each corner of the structure, their parapets adorned with statues of mythical creatures, griffins and lions, and eagles with spread wings. The roof bristled with chimneys, dozens of them, each one representing a fireplace that could warm a room larger than my entire cottage. The grounds stretched in every direction, sculpted gardens giving way to rolling parkland, deer grazing in the distance like figures from a pastoral painting. I had seen grand houses before. I had glimpsed them through gates as I delivered my work to their housekeepers. But I had never seen anything like this. This was not merely a house. This was a kingdom unto itself. The carriage swept up a drive lined with lime trees, their bare branches forming a canopy overhead, and deposited me at the foot of a staircase so wide that 20 people could have ascended abreast. The steps were carved from the same honey-colored stone as the house, worn smooth by centuries of feet. Footmen in crimson livery hurried to open the carriage door and assist me down, their faces impassive, trained to betray nothing. I clutched my worn traveling bag, acutely aware of how out of place I must look in my simple dress and country shawl, and tried to remember how to breathe. Miss Ashworth. I looked up and saw her descending the stairs toward me. She was perhaps 60 years old, tall and slender, dressed in black silk that whispered with each step. Her hair was silver, swept up in an elaborate arrangement that must have required an army of maids to achieve. Her face was handsome rather than beautiful, with high cheekbones and a mouth that suggested she had forgotten how to smile many years ago. But it was her eyes that commanded attention, dark and sharp and measuring, the eyes of a woman who had spent her life watching others fail to meet her standards. "I am the Dowager Duchess of Thornbury," she said, her voice cool as marble. "My son has informed me of your arrival. I confess I do not understand his reasoning, but I have learned not to question him. Follow me." She turned without waiting for my response and swept back up the stairs. I followed, my worn boots silent on the stone while her heels clicked a rhythm that sounded like disapproval. Through a grand entrance hall we went, a space so vast I could have fit my entire cottage inside it 3 times over. Portraits of ancestors lined the walls, men and women in the fashions of centuries past, their painted eyes seeming to follow me as I passed. They were handsome people, these Ashfords, with strong features and proud bearing, and I felt the weight of their collective gaze like a physical pressure against my skin. Vases of hothouse flowers stood on pedestals, perfuming the air with sweetness. Footmen stood like statues at every doorway, their expressions blank, their livery immaculate. Chandeliers dripped with crystal, catching the light of countless candles and scattering it across the ceiling in rainbow fragments. "My son is in the library," the dowager said over her shoulder, not slowing her pace. "He has requested a private audience with you. I trust you understand the honor being bestowed upon you." "I understand only that I was asked to come," I replied, my voice steady despite the trembling in my knees. "I do not yet know why." She stopped so abruptly that I nearly collided with her. When she turned, her eyes had narrowed to slits of black ice. "You are bold," she observed. "I am not certain whether that is admirable or foolish." "Perhaps it is both," I said, surprising myself with my own candor. For a moment I thought she might strike me. Her spine was rigid with indignation, her mouth a thin line of displeasure. Then something shifted in her expression. A flicker of something that might have been respect. Perhaps it is, she agreed. This way. The library was a cathedral of books. I had never seen so many books in one place. The room rose 3 stories tall, with ladders on brass rails that allowed access to the upper reaches, and balconies that circled each level like the boxes at an opera house. Shelves lined every wall, filled with volumes bound in leather of every color, their gold-lettered spines gleaming in the firelight. And what a fire it was! The hearth was large enough to roast an ox, and the flames that danced within it cast shifting shadows across the room. Candelabras scattered throughout the space created pools of warm light against the encroaching darkness of evening, for the sun had set during our walk through the house. The windows were tall and arched, framed by curtains of deep burgundy velvet. They looked out upon the gardens below, now blue and silver in the twilight, and beyond them, the parkland stretched into darkness. And there, standing before the fire with his back to me, was the Duke of Thornbury. He had not heard us enter, or perhaps he was simply not ready to turn. I had a moment to study him, the line of his shoulders beneath a coat of charcoal gray, the way his hands were clasped behind his back, the tension that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a furnace. He was different in this setting, this man who had slept in my parlor chair. There, he had been simply a traveler seeking shelter. Here, surrounded by the trappings of his wealth and power, he was something else entirely. Then the dowager cleared her throat, and he turned, and I saw his face clearly for the first time since that stormy night. He was older than I had thought, perhaps 35 or 36, but the years had not diminished him. If anything, they had refined him, carving deeper lines around his mouth and between his brows, adding gravity to features that already commanded attention. His dark hair was neatly combed now, not plastered to his forehead with rain, and his clothes were immaculate, the coat perfectly fitted, the cravat precisely tied. But it was his eyes that caught me. Those gray eyes, the color of storm clouds, met mine across the vast expanse of the library, and something shifted in my chest, a sensation I could not name and did not trust. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and his voice was exactly as I remembered it, deep and measured and touched with something like wonder. "Thank you for coming." The dowager withdrew without a word, closing the heavy doors behind her. The sound of the latch was loud in the sudden silence. I was alone with him now, alone in this magnificent room with its thousands of books and its dancing firelight and its silence that seemed to press against my skin. "Your Grace," I said, because I had to say something, and formality seemed safest. "You honor me with this invitation. But I confess I do not understand it." He moved away from the fire, crossing the room with long strides that ate the distance between us. He stopped perhaps 6 feet away, close enough that I could see the fine weave of his cravat and the shadows beneath his eyes. "Do you remember what you said to me," he asked, "that night in your cottage?" "I said very little, Your Grace." "Exactly." He began to pace, his movements restless, agitated. "You said almost nothing. You did not ask my name. You did not inquire about my business or my destination. You did not stammer or flutter or try to impress me. You simply opened your door, gave me shelter, and mended my coat while I sat there like a fool, unable to comprehend what was happening. "I repaired a torn seam," I said carefully. "It is what I do." He stopped pacing and faced me squarely. "Do you know how long it has been since anyone has done something for me without expecting something in return?" I did not answer. The question seemed rhetorical, and I did not want to presume. 4 years, he said. 4 years since I trusted anyone outside these walls. 4 years since I allowed myself to believe that kindness could exist without calculation. And then you, a stranger, a woman with nothing to gain from helping me, opened your door to me in a storm and asked for nothing. Nothing except that I conduct myself with basic decency. "Your Grace," I began. "Do not." His voice was harsh, almost angry, but I understood somehow that the anger was not directed at me. "Do not call me that. My name is Cassius, and before you protest that it would be improper, let me assure you that propriety means nothing to me, not anymore. I stood very still, trying to make sense of what he was telling me. This man, this duke, this cousin to the king, was confessing something to me, something raw and wounded and real. I did not know what to do with such a confession. I only knew that I could not pretend I had not heard it. "Mr. Ashford," I said, because I could not bring myself to use his Christian name, not yet. "You have brought me a long way from my home. Will you tell me why?" He was silent for a moment, his jaw tight with some internal struggle. Then he moved to a chair by the fire and sat heavily, gesturing for me to take the seat across from him. I sat on the edge of the cushion, my back straight, my hands folded in my lap. The fire crackled between us, and somewhere in the house a clock chimed the hour. "I was engaged to be married once," he said at last. His voice was quieter now, subdued. "Her name was Lady Sybil Drummond. She was beautiful, accomplished, everything a duchess should be. Our families had intended the match since we were young, and I believed, fool that I was, that she cared for me. Not for my title or my fortune, but for me." He paused, staring into the flames. I said nothing. I understood that he needed to tell this story, needed someone to hear it, and I could give him that much. 2 weeks before our wedding, I discovered that she had been conducting an affair with my closest friend, Percival Harrogate, the Earl of Westmere. They had been lovers for months, perhaps longer. The letters I found made it clear that she intended to marry me for my position and continue the affair afterward. I was to be a convenient fool, a title and a fortune to be exploited, while she gave her heart and her body to another. I drew a sharp breath. Such betrayal was not uncommon among the aristocracy, I knew. I had heard whispers of it from the servants of great houses, had glimpsed the evidence in the careful alterations required to accommodate changing figures, the tears on pillowcases I was given to mend. But the pain in his voice was achingly real, a wound that had not healed despite the passage of years. "I ended the engagement," he continued. "I challenged Harrogate to a duel, which he wisely declined. And then the scandal erupted. Lady Sybil and her family claimed that I had compromised her and then abandoned her. Harrogate supported their story. Half of London society took their side, believing that a woman so beautiful and well-bred could not possibly be capable of such deception. I became a villain in the eyes of the world, a monster who had ruined an innocent woman. I wanted to speak, to offer some comfort, but what comfort could I give? I knew nothing of his world, nothing of the machinations of the aristocracy. My life had been simple and small, concerned with stitches and seams, not with the intrigues of the powerful. "I retreated here," he said. "I cut myself off from society, from friends, from anyone who might betray me again. I trusted no one except my mother, and even she." He paused. Drawing a breath, even she was not certain of my innocence at first. It took years for her to believe me fully. He looked at me then, and the rawness in his eyes made my heart clench. "And then, 2 nights ago, I found myself on your doorstep. I had been riding, trying to outrun my own thoughts, and the storm caught me unawares. When you opened your door, I do not know what I expected. Fear, perhaps. Suspicion. The calculation I have seen in every face for 4 years, the constant assessment of what I am worth and what can be gained from me. But you showed me none of those things. You showed me only kindness. Simple, unadorned kindness." I folded my hands more tightly in my lap to keep them from trembling. No one had ever spoken to me like this before, with such unguarded honesty. It frightened me and drew me in equal measure. "I have a proposition for you," he said, leaning forward. "I need someone in this house who is not part of the world that betrayed me. Someone who will not play games or scheme for advantage. Someone who will tell me the truth, even when it is not what I wish to hear. I am offering you a position as my personal seamstress, with quarters in this house, a generous salary, and the freedom to come and go as you please. In return, I ask only for your honesty and your discretion." I stared at him. A position as his seamstress. It was a reasonable offer, even a generous one. But something in his voice told me there was more beneath the surface, more that he was not saying, more that perhaps he did not yet understand himself. "And if I refuse?" I asked. "Then the carriage will return you to Wiltshire tomorrow, and you will never hear from me again. I will not force you into anything. That is not the kind of man I wish to be." I thought of my cottage, my garden, my quiet life stitching other people's garments. I thought of the loneliness that waited for me there, the endless succession of days, unmarked by anything extraordinary. And I thought of this man, this wounded, complicated man who had sent 50 guards to my door because I had mended his coat without asking for anything in return. "I will stay," I said, "at least for a time. But I have conditions of my own." His eyebrows rose. "Name them. I am not a servant to be ordered about. I will work for you, but I will not grovel. I will speak my mind when I think it necessary, and I expect you to listen. And I require one afternoon a week to myself, to walk in the gardens, or read in the library, or simply be alone with my thoughts." For a long moment, he simply looked at me. The fire crackled. The clock ticked. And then, slowly, the corner of his mouth curved upward in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "You drive a hard bargain, Miss Ashworth." "I have had to," I replied. "Life has not been gentle with me." Something shifted in his expression, a softening, a recognition. "No," he said quietly, "I imagine it has not." We sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling between us. Outside, the last light of day had faded entirely, and the windows had become mirrors reflecting the warm glow of the room. "I will have Mrs. Pemberton show you to your quarters," he said finally. "She is the housekeeper, and she will see that you have everything you need. Tomorrow we can discuss the particulars of your work." He rose and moved to pull the bell cord, and just like that, the intimate atmosphere of our conversation shattered. He was the Duke of Thornbury again, distant and formal, and I was a seamstress who had somehow stumbled into his world. But as I followed the housekeeper through the labyrinthine corridors of Ashford Hall, past more portraits and more flowers and more footmen than I could count, I could not shake the feeling that something significant had happened in that library. A door had opened, not just for me, but for him as well. Where it would lead, I could not guess. My quarters were far grander than anything I had ever inhabited. The bedroom held a 4-poster bed draped in blue velvet, with hangings that could be drawn closed on cold nights. The mattress was thick, the pillows plump, the linen so fine that I was almost afraid to touch them. A sitting room adjoined the bedroom, furnished with a writing desk, a comfortable chair, and a window that looked out upon the east gardens. A dressing room contained a wardrobe larger than my entire cottage, its empty shelves waiting to be filled. Mrs. Pemberton, a stout woman with a kind face and sharp eyes, explained the workings of the household while a maid unpacked my meager belongings. She did not seem to judge the poverty of my possessions, the worn fabric of my spare dress, the modest size of my sewing basket. "The household rises at 6, she said, "but you are not expected to keep servants' hours. His Grace has made it clear that you are to be treated as a guest, not a member of the staff. Breakfast is served in the small dining room at 8. You may take your other meals in your room if you prefer." I absorbed this information in silence, trying to make sense of my new reality. A guest, not a servant. What did that make me? "One more thing," Mrs. Pemberton said, lowering her voice. "The Dowager Duchess does not approve of your presence here. She believes His Grace is acting rashly, and she will do everything in her power to convince him of his mistake. Be careful around her. She is not a cruel woman, but she is a proud one, and she does not forgive easily." I thanked her for the warning and promised to conduct myself with discretion. When she left, I stood at the window and looked out at the darkened gardens, the shapes of hedges and fountains barely visible in the moonlight. I thought of my mother, who had taught me to sew and to survive, who had told me that a woman's strength lay not in her circumstances, but in her character. I wondered what she would think of me now, standing in a duke's mansion, about to begin a life she could never have imagined. "I think," I whispered to the glass, "that you would tell me to be brave." The gardens offered no answer, but somewhere in the distance an owl called, and I chose to take it as an omen. The weeks that followed were a strange kind of education. I learned the rhythms of Ashford Hall, its rituals and hierarchies, its whispered gossip and unspoken rules. The household staff regarded me with suspicion at first, unsure of my position and therefore wary of my presence. I was not quite a servant, not quite a guest, not quite anything they understood. The footmen did not know whether to bow to me or ignore me. The maids did not know whether to address me as Miss or simply nod in passing. But I kept to myself, did my work diligently, and gradually their suspicion faded into grudging acceptance. I ate my breakfast alone in the small dining room, took long walks in the winter gardens, and spent my evenings in my sitting room with a book from the library which I had been given permission to access. My work itself was a revelation. The Duke's wardrobe was vast, filling an entire room adjacent to his chambers, and contained garments of such exquisite craftsmanship that my hands trembled the first time I touched them. Coats from the finest tailors in London, shirts of linen so delicate they seemed woven from cobwebs, cravats of silk that slipped through my fingers like water. I mended torn seams and replaced missing buttons and reinforced weakened fabric, and with each repair I felt a strange sense of purpose. These were not merely clothes, they were armor, the shell this wounded man presented to a world that had hurt him, and I was entrusted with their care. I saw the Duke infrequently during those early weeks. He spent most of his time in the library or his study, emerging only for meals and occasional rides across the estate. When we did encounter each other in the corridors or at the dining table, he was polite but distant, as if the intimacy of our first conversation had embarrassed him. I understood. I had my own armor, my own defenses against a world that had taught me to expect disappointment. But the Dowager Duchess was another matter entirely. She watched me with hawk-like vigilance, appearing in doorways and corridors as if by magic, her dark eyes cataloging my every movement. She never spoke to me directly unless absolutely necessary, but her presence was a constant reminder that I did not belong. One afternoon, perhaps 3 weeks after my arrival, I was summoned to her private sitting room. The message was delivered by a footman whose expression suggested I was being led to my execution, and I climbed the stairs to her quarters with my heart pounding against my ribs. The dowager's sitting room was decorated in shades of silver and gray, elegant and cold as its mistress. Pale silk covered the walls, and the furniture was upholstered in velvet, the color of winter storms. She sat by the window, silhouetted against the pale autumn light, and did not turn when I entered. "Close the door," she said. I obeyed and stood waiting, my hands clasped before me. "I have made inquiries about you," she continued, still not facing me. "Honoria Ashworth, daughter of Thomas Ashworth, a clerk, and Mary Ashworth, formerly Mary Pembury, a seamstress, both deceased. No living relatives, no fortune, no connections of any kind. That is correct, Your Grace." She turned then, and her face was unreadable. "Then why?" she asked softly. "Has my son installed you in this house as if you were visiting royalty?" I met her gaze without flinching. "I believe His Grace has already explained his reasons." "His Grace," she said, with a twist of her mouth that might have been contempt, "has explained nothing. He has told me only that you showed him kindness during a storm and that he intends to repay that kindness with employment. But I know my son, Miss Ashworth. I have watched him for 4 years, watched him withdraw from the world, watched him build walls around his heart so high that even I cannot scale them. And now you appear, this nobody from nowhere. and suddenly he is different. Not happier, perhaps, but different. And I want to know why. I considered my words carefully. When I met your son, I said, I did not know who he was. I saw only a man who needed shelter and whose coat needed mending. I gave him both because it was the decent thing to do. I expected nothing in return, and when he left the next morning, I assumed I would never see him again. And yet here you are. Yes, here I am. Not because I sought this position, but because your son offered it and I was foolish enough, or curious enough, to accept. I do not know what he wants from me, your grace. I am not certain he knows himself. But I am not a schemer or a fortune hunter. I am a seamstress who has spent her life working with her hands, and that is all I intend to do here. The dowager studied me for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. I do not believe you, she said. Not entirely. But I am willing to wait and watch. If you are what you claim to be, then perhaps you will be good for my son. And if you are not? She paused. If you are not, I will destroy you. Do you understand? I understand, I said. Good. You may go. I left her sitting room with my knees trembling but my head held high. I had faced harder things than one aristocratic woman's suspicion. I would survive this too. The autumn deepened into winter, and the gardens of Ashford Hall transformed into a wonderland of frost and silence. The hedgerows wore coats of white, the fountains stood frozen, the paths glittered with ice that crunched beneath my boots. I took my weekly walks through this crystalline landscape, my breath fogging in the cold air, and I felt myself changing with the seasons. The tight knot of anxiety that had lived in my chest for years was loosening, slowly, imperceptibly. I was not happy exactly, but I was something approaching content. My relationship with the Duke evolved as well, though I could not have said precisely how. He began appearing in my workroom in the evenings, ostensibly to discuss alterations to his garments, but our conversation soon wandered far from buttons and hems. He told me about his childhood, about riding ponies across the estate with his father, about learning Latin and Greek from tutors who despaired of his restless energy. He told me about his father, who had died when he was 12, thrown from a horse during a hunt, and about his mother's relentless determination to mold him into a worthy duke. He spoke of the loneliness of his position, the constant awareness that people saw his title before they saw him. I told him about my parents, about learning to sew by candlelight while my mother hummed her favorite songs, about my father reading aloud from the newspaper after supper. I told him about the long years of loneliness after their deaths, about the struggle to survive on my own, about the small victories that had sustained me. We spoke of books and music and philosophy. We argued about poetry. He preferred the romantics, with their grand emotions and sweeping landscapes, while I favored the metaphysicals, with their knotty intellect and unexpected comparisons. We discovered a shared love of astronomy, and on clear nights, he would take me to the observatory in the East Tower, and we would peer through the telescope at distant galaxies and spinning planets, two small figures contemplating the vastness of the universe, but there were boundaries between us, invisible lines neither of us crossed. He never touched me, not even accidentally. I never spoke of the scandal that had driven him into isolation, though I could feel its shadow lurking behind every conversation. We were two people circling each other, drawn together by something we could not name, but too wary to close the distance. Then, in late November, Lady Sybil Drummond returned to society. I learned of it from the gossip of the household staff, who spoke of little else for days. Lady Sybil had spent the past 4 years on the continent, living in Paris and Vienna and Rome, her reputation gradually rehabilitated by distance and time. She had become something of a legend in the salons of Europe, a beautiful woman wronged by a cruel duke, a romantic figure shrouded in mystery and tragedy. Now she had returned to England, and rumor had it she intended to reclaim her place in the highest circles of society, including, it was whispered, the Duke of Thornbury himself. I observed the effect this news had on him from a distance. His visits to my workroom ceased. He began taking his meals alone in his study. The dark circles returned beneath his eyes, and his jaw tightened whenever a servant mentioned her name. I wanted to speak to him, to offer some comfort, but I did not know how. What could I say? I was a seamstress, a nobody, and she was a lady of breeding and beauty, a woman who had once held his heart in her hands and crushed it. Whatever existed between us, whatever fragile thing we had been building, it seemed suddenly small and foolish in the face of that history. It was the dowager who forced the confrontation. She summoned us both to the drawing room one evening in early December, her face grave. The room was decorated for the coming Christmas season, with boughs of holly and wreaths of evergreen, but the festive touches seemed at odds with the tension in the air. "Lady Sybil has written to me," she announced when we were seated. "She wishes to call upon us next week. She claims she wants to apologize for the past and seek," she paused, seeking reconciliation. The Duke's expression could have been carved from stone. "And what have you told her?" "I have told her nothing. The decision is yours, Cassius. But I wanted you to be aware, and I wanted," she glanced at me, "all interested parties to be present for this conversation." I felt the blood rise to my cheeks. Interested parties. The implication was clear. "Miss Ashworth is not an interested party," the Duke said coldly. "She is an employee." "Is she?" The dowager's voice was mild, but her eyes were sharp. "I have watched the two of you for weeks. Do not insult my intelligence by pretending there is nothing between you." The silence that followed was suffocating. I stared at my hands, unable to meet either of their gazes. "Whatever there is between Miss Ashworth and myself," the Duke said finally, "it is none of Lady Sybil's concern. Nor is it yours, Mother. Everything that affects this family is my concern. And Lady Sybil's return affects this family, whether you acknowledge it or not. She still has powerful friends. She could still damage your reputation further. Or she could help repair it, if you allowed her to apologize publicly. I do not want her apology. I want nothing from her except her absence. That may not be possible." The dowager rose and smoothed her skirts. "Think about what I have said. I will await your decision regarding her visit." She swept from the room, leaving the Duke and me alone. He stood at the window, his back rigid, his hands clenched at his sides. The firelight cast his shadow across the carpet, long and dark. "I should go," I said quietly. "Stay." The word was almost a command, but I heard the plea beneath it. "Please." I stayed. I sat in my chair and watched him struggle with whatever storm was raging inside him. And finally, after what felt like hours, he turned. "She was my entire world once," he said. "Sybil. I loved her with the blind devotion of a young man who had never been hurt. When I discovered her betrayal, I thought I would die of it. I thought nothing could ever hurt so much again." He moved toward me, slowly, as if approaching a wild animal. But I was wrong, because the worst pain was not losing her. The worst pain was losing myself. I became this, he gestured at himself, this cold, suspicious creature who trusts no one and expects nothing good from anyone. And I have been so alone, Honoria. So terribly alone. It was the first time he had used my Christian name. It sounded different in his voice, softer, more intimate. "You are not alone," I said. "Not anymore." He stood before me now, close enough that I could see the pulse beating in his throat. "Am I not? Then what are we to each other, you and I? Because I cannot continue like this, dancing around what I feel, pretending it does not exist. I need to know if we, mean anything to you." I rose from my chair, closing the last distance between us. My heart was pounding so hard, I was certain he could hear it. "You are asking me to speak of things I have never spoken of," I said. "Things I am not certain I understand myself. Then let me speak first." He took my hands in his, and the warmth of his fingers against my cold skin made me gasp. "I am falling in love with you, Honoria Ashworth. I have been falling since the night you opened your door to a stranger and asked nothing of him. And I am terrified because the last time I let myself love someone, she destroyed me. I looked up into his gray eyes and saw everything there, the fear, the hope, the desperate longing for something real. I cannot promise you anything, I whispered. I do not know what the future holds for either of us. But I know that when I am with you, the world makes more sense than it ever has before. And if that is love, then yes, I feel it too. He drew me closer, his forehead resting against mine. We stood like that for a long moment, breathing each other in, two damaged people finding something whole in their brokenness. Whatever comes, he said, we will face it together. Lady Sybil, society, my mother's disapproval, all of it. Together. Together, I agreed. And when he kissed me, gently, reverently, as if I were something precious he was afraid of breaking, I felt the last of my defenses crumble. Whatever this was, whatever we were becoming, it was worth the risk. The days before Lady Sybil's visit passed in a strange suspension. Cassius, as I now called him in the privacy of my thoughts, seemed lighter, as if confessing his feelings had lifted a weight from his shoulders. We stole moments together when we could, walks in the winter garden where our breath mingled in the cold air, conversations by the fire where our fingers brushed and lingered, glances across the dinner table that said more than words ever could. The staff noticed, I was certain of it. The footmen exchanged knowing looks. The maids whispered when they thought I could not hear. But they said nothing directly, and I suspected they were simply glad to see their master emerging from his long isolation. The dowager watched us with an expression I could not read. She had not spoken to me since that night in the drawing room, but her silence felt more like contemplation than condemnation. I did not know what to make of her, this formidable woman who guarded her son with such fierce devotion. Perhaps she was waiting to see if I would prove worthy. Perhaps she was already planning my destruction. And then Lady Sybil arrived. She came on a gray December afternoon, her carriage sweeping up the drive with all the grandeur of a royal procession. I watched from my window as footmen hurried to assist her, as the front doors swung open to receive her. I could not see her face from this distance, only the elegant line of her figure and the rich burgundy of her traveling cloak. I had not been invited to greet her. That much at least had been established. I was still an employee, whatever else I might have become, and my presence at such a meeting would have been inappropriate. So I stayed in my room and pretended to work on a waistcoat that needed new buttons and tried not to imagine what was happening in the drawing room below. An hour passed. Then 2. I heard footsteps in the corridor, voices raised in conversation, but nothing distinct. My needle pierced the fabric over and over, steady and precise, an anchor against the storm of my thoughts. When the knock came at my door, I jumped so violently that I pricked my finger. "Enter," I called, pressing a handkerchief to the tiny wound. It was Cassius. His face was pale, his jaw set, but there was something fierce in his eyes that had not been there before. "She is gone," he said, "for now." What happened? He crossed the room and took me in his arms, holding me so tightly that I could scarcely breathe. "She came to apologize," he said into my hair. "She wept and pleaded and swore that she had been young and foolish and manipulated by Harrowgate. She begged me to forgive her, to give her another chance, to remember what we had once meant to each other." "And what did you say?" He pulled back to look at me, his hands cupping my face. "I told her that I had already given my heart to someone else, someone who had never lied to me, never schemed against me, never asked me for anything except honesty and respect. I told her that I was done with games and manipulation, and that if she had any decency left, she would accept my refusal and leave me in peace. I searched his eyes for doubt, for regret. I found none. She did not take it well," he continued. "She accused me of throwing myself away on a—" He hesitated. "On a nobody," I finished for him. "A seamstress with no fortune and no connections. Her words, not mine." His thumb traced the curve of my cheek. I told her that titles and fortunes mean nothing to me anymore. I told her that I would rather spend my life with an honest woman who mends my coat in silence than with a beautiful liar who would smile to my face while stabbing me in the back. Tears were spilling down my cheeks now, though I had not felt them start. "She will not accept this," I said. "A woman like that does not surrender easily." "No," he agreed. "She will scheme and plot and try to turn society against us. My mother believes she will spread rumors, try to paint you as a fortune hunter or worse. The road ahead will not be easy." "I have never looked for an easy road," I said, "only a true one." He kissed me then, not gently this time, but with a fierce passion that left me breathless. When we parted, his eyes were blazing. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is too soon. I know there are obstacles. I know my mother will object, and society will gossip, and Lady Sybil will do everything in her power to stop us. But I cannot imagine my life without you anymore. Marry me, Honoria. Be my Duchess. Be my partner in all things." I looked at this man, this broken, beautiful man who had found something worth saving in me. I thought of my cottage in Wiltshire, my quiet life, my small dreams. And I thought of the future stretching before us, uncertain and terrifying and wonderful. "Yes," I said, "yes, I will marry you." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparations and confrontations. The Dowager, when told of our engagement, did not react as I had expected. She did not rage or threaten or demand that Cassius reconsider. Instead, she sat in silence for a long moment, studying my face with those dark, unreadable eyes. "You love him," she said finally. It was not a question. "I do," I replied. "And you understand what you're taking on? The scrutiny, the criticism, the weight of a title you were never born to carry? I understand that I am taking on a man, not a title. The title is incidental." She almost smiled. Almost. "You are either very brave or very foolish, Miss Ashworth." "Perhaps both," I said, echoing our first exchange. This time, she did smile, a small, reluctant curving of her lips. "Perhaps both," she agreed. "Very well. If my son is determined to marry you, then I will do everything in my power to ensure the match succeeds. I will not have him hurt again, not by you, not by society, not by anyone." It was not quite a blessing, but it was acceptance, and I took it gratefully. Lady Sybil, true to form, did not accept defeat gracefully. Rumors began to circulate through London society, whispers about the Duke of Thornbury and his scandalous attachment to a common seamstress. Some said I had bewitched him with dark arts. Others claimed I was carrying on affairs with half the footmen in his household. The stories grew more outlandish with each telling, but none of them touched me. I had spent my life being underestimated and overlooked. A few malicious whispers could not shake me now. What did shake me was the letter that arrived in late January, 3 weeks before our wedding was to take place. It bore the seal of the Earl of Westmere, Percival Harrowgate, the man who had been Lady Sybil's lover, the man who had helped destroy Cassius's reputation. I found it on my writing desk, placed there by some servant who had not thought to question its origin. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. "Miss Ashworth," it read, "we have not met, but I believe we have a mutual interest. I have information regarding Lady Sybil that may be of use to you, information that could silence her attacks against you and your betrothed once and for all. Meet me tomorrow afternoon at the old chapel on the eastern edge of the Thornbury estate. Come alone." It was signed with a flourishing P. I should have shown the letter to Cassius immediately. I should have trusted him to handle the situation, whatever it was. But something held me back, some instinct that told me this was a trap, and that if I walked into it unprepared, I might be able to turn it to our advantage. The old chapel was a ruin, half collapsed and choked with ivy, a remnant of some earlier age when a village had stood on the eastern edge of the estate. I arrived at the appointed time, bundled in my warmest cloak, my heart hammering in my chest. The winter sun was pale and distant, offering little warmth, and my breath formed clouds in the frigid air. Harrowgate was waiting inside, standing among the fallen stones and dead leaves. He was a tall, fair-haired man with a handsome face and cold blue eyes. He smiled when he saw me. The practiced smile of a man accustomed to charming women. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "thank you for coming." I did not return his smile. "You said you had information about Lady Sybil. Speak quickly. I do not intend to stay long." His smile faltered. So direct. Not at all what I expected from a simple seamstress. "I am not simple," I replied, "and you would do well to remember it." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of reassessment. "Very well. I will be blunt. Lady Sybil is planning something, some scheme to destroy your engagement and reclaim Thornbury for herself. I do not know the details, but I know it involves forged letters, planted evidence, something that will make it appear as though you have been unfaithful. Why are you telling me this? You were her accomplice once. Why would you betray her now?" He moved closer, his voice dropping. "Because she betrayed me first. After Thornbury cast her off, she promised we would be together, that all her scheming had been for our future. Instead, she abandoned me the moment she reached the continent, left me to face the scandal alone while she reinvented herself in Paris salons. I have spent 4 years nursing my resentment, Miss Ashworth, and now I have a chance to repay her in kind." I studied his face, searching for deception. He was telling the truth, I thought, or at least part of it. His bitterness was too raw to be feigned. "What do you want in return for this information?" "Only one thing." His eyes met mine, the satisfaction of seeing her fail. I considered this. It was not enough. A man like Harrowgate did not give something for nothing. "You are lying," I said. "There is more. What is it?" He was silent for a moment. Then he laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You are remarkable," he said. "Very well. I want Thornbury to know that it was I who helped you. I want him to owe me something, even if it is only the acknowledgement that I acted honorably for once in my miserable life." That I believed. The desire for redemption, even a twisted version of it, was something I understood. "Tell me what you know," I said. He told me. Lady Sybil had hired a forger to create letters supposedly written by me to a fictitious lover. She planned to present them at a society event, claiming she had discovered evidence of my infidelity. The scandal would destroy the engagement and, she hoped, drive Cassius back into her arms. It was a clever scheme, and it might have worked if I had not been warned. I returned to Ashford Hall and told Cassius everything. His face went through a dozen emotions as he listened, rage and disbelief, and finally something like grim satisfaction. "We will stop her," he said, "and we will make certain everyone knows what she has done." The confrontation happened at Lady Pemberton's winter ball, 3 days before our wedding. Lady Sybil had chosen this venue for her revelation, knowing that all of society would be watching. The ballroom was magnificent, decorated with hundreds of candles and great swags of winter greenery. The cream of English society had gathered, earls and countesses and lords and ladies, all dressed in their finest silks and jewels. I stood at Cassius's side, wearing a gown of deep green velvet that the dowager herself had helped me select. I was nervous, more nervous than I had ever been in my life, but I kept my chin high and my hands steady. Lady Sybil entered the ballroom like a queen, resplendent in white silk that made her look like an angel. She stood in the center of the room, holding a packet of letters tied with a pink ribbon, and announced in ringing tones that she had discovered evidence of Miss Ashworth's true character. Before she could continue, Cassius stepped forward. He held his own packet of letters, copies we had obtained through Harrowgate's contacts, documents proving the forgery. "These letters are false," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. "They were created by a forger named Whitley, who has already confessed under the pressure of certain legal inquiries. Lady Sybil commissioned them in an attempt to destroy my engagement and rehabilitate her own reputation." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Lady Sybil's face went white. "This is absurd," she cried. "You cannot prove anything." But he could, and he did. The forger's confession was read aloud. Witnesses testified to Lady Sybil's meetings with him. By the end of the evening, her reputation was in ruins, and she fled the ballroom with tears streaming down her face. I felt no triumph in her destruction, only a weary relief. The battle was over. We had won. Our wedding took place on a crisp February morning, in the chapel at Ashford Hall where Cassius's parents had been married, and their parents before them. The sun shone through the stained glass windows, casting jeweled light across the stone floor. The Dowager Duchess stood as witness, her face composed, but her eyes suspiciously bright. When the vicar asked if anyone knew of any impediment to the marriage, she stepped forward, and my heart stopped. "I know of no impediment," she said clearly. "But I wish to say publicly that I have never seen my son so happy, and I welcome Miss Ashworth into our family with all my heart." It was a gift, I realized, a public declaration of acceptance that would silence any remaining doubters. I blinked back tears and mouthed my thanks. The household staff lined the corridor as we emerged from the chapel, throwing flower petals and cheering as if we were royalty. And perhaps, in that moment, we were. Not because of titles or fortunes, but because we had found something rare and precious in a world that often seemed determined to deny it. We had found each other. The years that followed were not without challenges. Society accepted me slowly, grudgingly, won over by my quiet dignity and Cassius's unwavering devotion. There were those who never quite forgave me for rising above my station, who whispered behind their fans and cut me at parties. But there were others, kinder souls, who saw in our story something hopeful, proof that love could transcend the barriers of class and circumstance. The Dowager became, if not exactly warm, then at least respectful. We developed a rapport based on mutual admiration for our stubbornness, and in time I came to understand that her sharpness was simply her way of protecting those she loved. I never forgot where I came from. I continued to sew, not out of necessity, but out of love, and I taught the skill to the daughters of the household staff, passing on the gift my mother had given me. The cottage in Wiltshire I kept as well, visiting it sometimes on summer afternoons, sitting in the garden where my parents had once sat and remembering, and Cassius, my husband, my partner, my heart. He smiled more now, laughed more, allowed himself to trust again. The walls around his heart had crumbled, and in their place something new had grown, something tender and fierce and indestructible. I found him one evening in the library, sitting in the chair by the fire where I had first seen him, so many years ago. He looked up when I entered, and his face lit with that smile that still made my heart skip. "What are you thinking about?" I asked, settling into the chair across from him. "The night we met," he said. "The storm, your cottage, the way you mended my coat without asking anything in return." I smiled. It was just a torn seam. "No." He leaned forward, taking my hands in his. "It was everything. It was the first kindness I had known in years. It was the moment my life began again." I lifted his hands to my lips and kissed them. "Then it seems we both have that torn coat to thank." He laughed, a sound that still felt like a miracle to me. Perhaps we should have it framed, hung in the gallery with the other family treasures. I considered this. It would make an unusual portrait. We are an unusual family. And we were. A duke and a seamstress, bound together by chance and choice and the stubborn refusal to accept the fate the world had assigned us. We were proof that love could bloom in the most unlikely places, that kindness could open doors that wealth and power could not, that the truest nobility was not found in bloodlines, but in hearts. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall, blanketing the gardens in white silence. The fire crackled, the candles flickered, and my husband held my hands as if he would never let go. I had mended a stranger's torn coat in silence, expecting nothing in return. and in return, I had received everything. That is the story of how I became the Duchess of Thornbury. It is a story I have told many times now, to friends and family and curious strangers who want to know how a seamstress from Wiltshire came to stand at the side of one of England's most powerful men. Each time I tell it, I find something new in it, some detail I had forgotten, some meaning I had not fully understood. But the heart of the story remains the same. Love is not a transaction. It cannot be bought or bargained for or won through schemes and stratagems. It can only be given, freely and without expectation, like a torn coat mended in silence while the storm rages outside. And if you are very, very lucky, it will be returned to you 100-fold. I know this because I am very, very lucky, and I am eternally, profoundly grateful. There is a particular morning I remember, perhaps 5 years after our wedding, that captures the essence of the life we built together. I woke before dawn, as I often did, and slipped from our bed without disturbing Cassius. The house was quiet, the servants not yet stirring, and I made my way through the familiar corridors to my private sitting room, where my sewing basket still waited by the window. I had long since stopped working for necessity. As Duchess, I had access to the finest dressmakers in London, women who would have swooned at the opportunity to clothe me. But I could not give up the craft that had defined my life for so long. It was my meditation, my connection to my mother, my way of remaining grounded amid the grandeur that now surrounded me. That morning, I was working on a handkerchief, embroidering forget-me-nots in the corner, the same flowers my mother had stitched on the lining of my sewing basket. It was a small project, something I could complete in a few hours, and I worked in the gray pre-dawn light, my needle moving with the rhythm of long practice. I did not hear Cassius enter. I only became aware of his presence when he settled into the chair across from me, still in his dressing gown, his hair tousled from sleep. "I thought I would find you here," he said softly. I smiled without looking up from my work. "You know me too well. I know that you cannot stay idle, even in the small hours of the morning." He watched my hands for a moment, the way he had watched me that first night in my cottage, with that same focused attention. "What are you making?" "A handkerchief." I turned it so he could see the design taking shape. "For Mrs. Pemberton. She mentioned last week that her daughter is to be married, and I thought a gift from the house would be appropriate. You could have commissioned something from a London shop. I could have. But this is better. This has meaning." He was silent for a moment. Then he rose and crossed to where I sat, kneeling beside my chair so that our eyes were level. "Do you know," he said, "that I fall in love with you again every day? Every time I see you doing something like this, something kind and thoughtful and utterly unpretentious, I am reminded of why I crossed half of Wiltshire to bring you here." I set down my embroidery and cupped his face in my hands. "And do you know that I am grateful every day that you did? That I thank Providence for the storm that drove you to my door, and for the torn seam that gave me a reason to show you kindness?" He kissed my palms, one and then the other. "We are a pair of sentimental fools," he murmured. "Perhaps, but we are happy fools. We are that." The sun was rising now, painting the sky outside my window in shades of pink and gold. Cassius helped me to my feet, and we stood together watching the dawn break over Ashford Hall, our home, our kingdom, our refuge from a world that had once seemed determined to keep us apart. There would be challenges ahead, I knew. There always were. The Tun would never fully accept me, and there would always be those who whispered that the Duke of Thornbury had married beneath him. But I had long since stopped caring about their opinions. I had Cassius. I had a home. I had work that brought me joy and a purpose that extended beyond myself. And I had learned, in those years since a stranger knocked on my door, that the true measure of a life is not in the circumstances we are born into, but in the choices we make. I had chosen kindness on a stormy night, and that choice had led me here, to this moment, to this man, to this improbable and beautiful life. I picked up my embroidery again, as the household began to stir around us. Cassius settled back into his chair, content to watch me work. And we passed the morning in companionable silence, two people who had found in each other the one thing they had never dared to hope for: home. Some months later, I found myself alone in the gallery where the family portraits hung. I had walked past these paintings hundreds of times by now, but that afternoon I stopped before each one, really looking at the faces of the Ashfords who had come before. There was the first Duke, granted his title by a long-dead king for services in some forgotten war. His face was stern, his armor gleaming, his hand resting on the hilt of a sword. Beside him hung his wife, a delicate woman with sad eyes and a mouth that seemed to want to smile but could not quite manage it. There were their descendants, generation after generation, dukes and duchesses and their children, an unbroken line stretching back centuries. The fashion changed from portrait to portrait, ruffs giving way to lace, giving way to the simpler styles of recent years, but the faces remained remarkably consistent. The same strong jaw, the same gray eyes, the same air of pride and privilege. And now, at the end of the gallery, hung a new portrait. It had been commissioned shortly after our wedding, painted by a famous artist who had come to Ashford Hall and spent weeks capturing our likenesses. I studied it with a critical eye. The artist had been skilled, I had to admit. He had caught Cassius perfectly, the intelligence in his eyes, the hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth, the way he held himself with authority, tempered by kindness. He looked like a man who had suffered and emerged stronger for it. And me. I looked at the woman in the portrait and barely recognized her. She wore a gown of deep blue silk, the color of the coat I had mended so long ago. Her hair was arranged in the current fashion, with pearls woven through the curls. Her expression was serene, confident, the expression of a woman who knew her place in the world and was content with it. Was that really me? The seamstress from Wiltshire who had opened her door to a stranger in a storm? Yes, I decided. It was me. Not all of me, perhaps, for a portrait could not capture the calluses on my fingers or the memories that lived in my heart. But it was the me I had become, the me that love and circumstance had shaped. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find the dowager approaching. She moved more slowly now than she had when we first met. Her silver hair turned white, her back not quite as straight, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. "Admiring your likeness," she asked, coming to stand beside me. Trying to reconcile it with my memories, I admitted. She made a sound that might have been a laugh. That is the trouble with portraits. They capture only a moment, and we are foolish enough to think that moment represents something eternal. We stood in silence for a moment, looking at the painting. "I was wrong about you," the dowager said abruptly. I turned to face her, surprised. "Your Grace? When you first came here, I was convinced you were a fortune hunter, or at worst, some schemer sent by my son's enemies to destroy him. I watched you for weeks, waiting for you to reveal your true nature. But you never did, because there was nothing to reveal. You were exactly what you appeared to be, a kind, honest woman who had shown my son compassion when he needed it most." I did not know what to say. In all the years I had known her, the dowager had never been so direct about her feelings. "I am not good at apologies," she continued, "so I will not attempt one. But I want you to know that I consider you the best thing that has ever happened to my son. And I am grateful, more grateful than I can express, that you had the courage to accept his proposal and face down every obstacle that stood in your path." She reached out and squeezed my hand, a gesture so unexpected that I nearly gasped. "You are a true Ashford now," she said. "Not because you married one, but because you have earned the name through your character. Never forget that." She released my hand and walked away, leaving me alone with the portraits and a heart too full for words. The seasons turned, as they always do. Spring arrived with its burst of color and birdsong, and I spent long hours in the gardens, watching the roses my mother would have loved come into bloom. Summer brought picnics on the lawn and lazy afternoons reading in the shade of the ancient oaks. Autumn painted the hills in gold and crimson, and I gathered apples from the orchard and made pies the way my mother had taught me, much to the astonishment of the kitchen staff. And winter brought Christmas at Ashford Hall, a celebration unlike anything I had ever experienced. The house was transformed into a wonderland of greenery and candlelight. Holly and ivy adorned every mantel and doorway. A great tree stood in the entrance hall, decorated with ribbons and candles and ornaments that had been in the family for generations. The servants received gifts and bonuses, and a feast was held in the great hall where everyone, from the highest to the lowest, was welcome. I presided over these festivities at Cassius's side, no longer the uncertain newcomer, but the mistress of the house, confident in my place. I had learned the 1,000 small duties that fell to a duchess, the management of the household, the coordination of the staff, the endless social obligations that filled my calendar. But I had not lost myself in the process. I still sewed every morning, still visited my cottage in Wiltshire when I could, still remembered where I had come from and the woman my mother had raised me to be. On Christmas morning, Cassius and I exchanged gifts in the privacy of our chambers before joining the household for the day's celebrations. I gave him a waistcoat I had made with my own hands, embroidered with the Ashford crest in silver thread. He gave me a locket that contained, on one side, a miniature portrait of my parents, copied from the only image that remained of them, and on the other, a lock of his own hair. "Where did you find this?" I asked, touching my parents' faces with trembling fingers. I had no portrait of them, had always mourned that lack. "I had inquiries made," he said. "There was a sketch artist in your village who had drawn them once, for a church record. It took months to track it down, but I thought you would want it." I threw my arms around him and wept into his shoulder, overcome by a grief and gratitude too tangled to separate. He held me until the storm passed, stroking my hair, murmuring words of comfort. When I finally pulled back, wiping my eyes, I managed a watery smile. "You are a good man, Cassius Ashford." "I had excellent instruction," he replied. "A certain seamstress taught me that kindness matters more than titles." We kissed then, a long, slow kiss that tasted of tears and joy and all the years we had shared. "I love you," I whispered against his lips. "And I love you," he replied, "today and always." It is strange, looking back, how the moments that define our lives are so often small and quiet. Not the grand gestures, the public declarations, the dramatic confrontations, but the private instances of connection, the shared glances across a crowded room, the hands reaching for each other in the dark. I think of the night Cassius came to my door, drenched and weary and in need of shelter. I think of the torn coat I mended while he slept, the stitches so small they disappeared into the fabric. I think of the morning he left without a word, leaving only gold behind, and I think of the afternoon 50 guards arrived to carry me into a life I had never dared to imagine. These are the moments that changed everything. Not because they were exceptional, but because they were true. Because in each of them, I made a choice to be kind, to be honest, to be open to whatever the world might bring. My mother used to say that we cannot control our circumstances, only our responses to them. She was right, of course. She usually was. But what she did not tell me, what I had to discover for myself, was that sometimes our responses have the power to change our circumstances entirely. A torn coat mended in silence brought me here, to this life, to this love. A simple act of kindness opened a door I did not even know existed. And when I walked through that door, I found not just a duke and a mansion and a title, but myself. The woman I was always meant to be. I am Honoria Ashford, Duchess of Thornbury. I was born a seamstress's daughter, and I will carry that identity with me always, no matter how many titles I accumulate. Because it is not where we come from that defines us. It is who we choose to be. And I choose kindness, I choose honesty, I choose love, every day for the rest of my life. This is my story, but it is also a reminder. To whoever reads these words, wherever you may be, whatever circumstances may bind you. The world will try to convince you that you are small, that your actions do not matter, that kindness is weakness and hope is folly. Do not believe it. Believe instead in the power of a single act, a single choice, a single moment of grace extended to a stranger in need. You never know what door that moment might open, what life it might transform, what love it might begin. I opened my door on a stormy night, expecting nothing but to offer shelter to a traveler in need. And in return, I received the world. Let that be the lesson of my story. Let that be the truth I leave behind. Kindness is never wasted. Love is always possible. And even the most ordinary among us can find our way to extraordinary lives. I believe this because I have lived it, and I am living proof that dreams do come true, even dreams we never dared to dream.